She drove 4 miles through mud and rain on a borrowed horse with a suitcase tied to the saddle and exactly $3.40 in her coat pocket. When Benjamin Carter opened that door, she didn't flinch, didn't apologize for the water dripping off her hat brim, didn't soften her voice 1 degree. "I heard you run the hardest ranch in Silver Creek," she said. "Good. Because I'm the hardest worker you've never hired. Give me 30 days. If I don't prove it, I'll walk back to town the same way I came." He hadn't smiled in 6 years. Something moved across his face anyway. Subscribe to our channel, ride this story all the way to the end with Anna and Benjamin, and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. We want to know how far this trail reaches. The rain had been falling since before noon, and Anna Whitaker had been walking since before the rain started. Her boots were soaked through. Her coat, the good one she'd kept clean through every hard mile of the past 6 months, had finally surrendered to the weather and hung heavy against her arms. The worn leather suitcase in her right hand had stopped feeling heavy about 4 miles back. Now it just felt like part of her body. Another weight she carried because there was no other option. She knew what she looked like. She knew exactly what a woman arriving at a cattle ranch on foot in the middle of a rainstorm looked like to the people who watched from behind curtained windows in Silver Creek. She'd felt their eyes when she walked through town. Heard the particular silence that spread when a woman came through alone without a husband, without a family name. Anyone recognized, without any of the things that told frontier people you were someone they should take seriously. She'd been living inside that silence for 6 months. She was tired of it. The road that led to Carter Ranch wound up from the edge of town, through land that opened up wide and flat, before rising into rougher ground near the ridge. She'd gotten directions from the man at the general store, though he'd given them reluctantly the way people give information they suspect will be wasted. He'd looked at her traveling bag, then at her face, and she'd seen the calculation behind his eyes. The quiet arithmetic people performed when a woman stood in front of them asking for something practical. Too young to be a widow. Too neat to be completely destitute. Too serious to be looking for the kind of arrangement some men offered. He'd given her the directions anyway. Anna followed them without hesitation. She had learned something in the months since her family's farm collapsed under debt. She hadn't fully understood until it was too late. She had learned that hesitation was a luxury. That the moment you stopped moving was the moment the weight of everything you'd lost caught up with you and sat down on your chest and refused to get up. She didn't stop moving. The gate to Carter Ranch was iron newer than everything else on the property, which told her the man who owned this land paid attention to what mattered functionally and didn't spend unnecessary money on appearances. The fence posts were solid. The wire was tight. She noticed these things because she'd grown up noticing them, raised by a father who taught her that the condition of a man's fencing told you more about his character than anything he said at church. Benjamin Carter kept his fencing in excellent condition. She walked through the gate. The ranch hands she passed didn't stop her immediately, which surprised her. 2 of them watched her cross the yard from their position near the barn, and she met their eyes directly and kept walking. One of them called out, "Ma'am, can we help you?" "I'm here to speak with Mr. Carter," she said. She didn't slow down. The closer one, a young man with a red kerchief around his neck, exchanged a look with the other. "Mr. Carter don't generally receive visitors this time of day." "He'll receive me," Anna said. "Which door?" There was a pause. The young man with the red kerchief seemed genuinely uncertain what to do with a woman who simply didn't accept his answer as the final word. "Front door, ma'am, but I'd suggest—" "Thank you," she said, and kept walking. She heard one of them say something low to the other behind her back. She didn't turn around. She climbed the porch steps, set her suitcase down beside her right foot, and knocked on the door 3 times. Firm. Not aggressive, but firm enough that the sound didn't apologize for itself. She waited. Nothing. She knocked again. This time she heard movement inside. Boot heels on wood floor. Slow, deliberate steps. The footsteps of a man who moved through his own house, the way he moved through everything else. Like the pace was something he controlled, and he wasn't about to let a knock on the door change it. The door opened. Benjamin Carter was not what she'd expected, though she'd told herself she wasn't building expectations. She'd heard things in town. People talked about him the way they talked about geography. He was a feature of Silver Creek the same way the ridge to the north was a feature. He'd been there long enough to become part of what the place was, and nobody spent much time wondering if a mountain had feelings. How was taller than she'd imagined, broader through the shoulders. He had the kind of face that had been weathered over a long period of time by wind and sun, and something else, something internal, that left marks just as deep. His hair was dark with threads of early gray at the temples. He was, she estimated, somewhere in his mid-30s, though the lines around his eyes suggested a man who had lived those years at a particular cost. He looked at her. She looked at him. She could feel the rain still working its way through her coat, and she stood straight anyway. "Mr. Carter," she said. "My name is Anna Whitaker. I'm here about employment." I didn't say anything for a moment. He was taking inventory in the same way she was reading the facts available in front of him, running the arithmetic. She watched him notice the suitcase, the soaked coat, the boots, the way she was standing, which she made sure communicated that she was here on business and not asking for anything that resembled charity. "Employment," he repeated. His voice was lower than she expected, like something that had been used sparingly over many years and had lost the habit of ringing out. "Yes, sir." "What kind of employment?" "Household management primarily. Supply inventory, financial record-keeping, cooking correspondence, and whatever else the running of this ranch requires that isn't being done properly at present." She kept her voice level. "I've had a look at the scope of this operation from the road and from the yard. You have more square footage in that bunkhouse than most hotels I've passed through, and your supply management, from what the hands were doing an hour ago, suggests nobody has organized this operation systematically in quite some time." Something moved behind his eyes. She couldn't tell if it was irritation or interest. She suspected it was both. "You assessed my ranch from the road," he said. "I assessed what was visible from the road," she said. "I can do considerably better than that once I'm inside." "You have a lot of confidence for someone standing on my porch in the rain." "Yes, sir," she said. "I do." The silence stretched. She could hear water dripping off the porch roof to her left. She didn't look at it. She kept her eyes on his face. "How'd you get here?" he said finally. "I walked from town." "It's 4 miles." "I'm aware." He leaned his shoulder against the doorframe. He wasn't moving to invite her in, but he wasn't shutting the door either, and she recognized that as the only opening she was going to get. "I had a housekeeper," he said. 3 years ago, she left to marry a man in Denver." "What happened to the position after she left?" "Nothing happened to it. It didn't get filled." "I can see that," Anna said, respectfully. That landed differently than she intended, but she didn't take it back. She watched something flicker across his face. Amusement, maybe. Or the ghost of it, a reflex. His expression still made, even though the feeling behind it had become unfamiliar. "Come in," he said. He stepped back from the door. She picked up her suitcase and walked inside. The inside of the ranch house told her everything the outside had already started suggesting. The space was large and structurally sound, and completely without any sense that anyone lived in it with intention. The furniture was good quality, substantial pieces that had been bought with money and sense. But they'd been arranged once years ago and left. Nothing had been moved to accommodate actual living. There were no small adjustments. No evidence of the continuous unconscious reorganization that happened when someone occupied a space fully. The desk in the corner of the main room had papers on it that hadn't been touched recently. She could tell because the dust had settled on them in a specific pattern that suggested the papers had been there long enough to become furniture themselves. She noticed a stack of supply ledgers on a shelf that were 2 years out of date, based on the dates printed on their spines. Benjamin Carter watched her take in the room without commenting on it. "Sit down," he said. He gestured toward the chairs near the fireplace. She sat. She kept her spine straight and her hands folded in her lap and her suitcase beside her foot on the floor. He didn't sit immediately. He stood with his arms crossed and looked at her with the frank assessment of a man who had spent his life making decisions about stock. She was being evaluated, and she understood that, and she didn't flinch from it. "Tell me where you come from," he said. "Kansas," she said. "My family had a farm south of Dodge City. My parents died 3 years ago, within 6 months of each other, and I stayed to manage the land. I kept it running for 2 years. She paused. I lost it to debt 7 months ago. The debt existed before I arrived, but I didn't fully understand the extent of it until it was too late. You ran the farm yourself for 2 years? Yes. How old are you? 25. I was quiet for a moment. What happened after you lost the land? I looked for work, she said simply. I've been looking for 7 months. I had skills my father taught me, practical skills, management, accounting, animal care. But the work that was available to a woman alone in most places I tried was either domestic service at wages I couldn't live on or situations that required a husband's name attached to mine. She let that settle. I'm not looking for a husband's name, Mr. Carter. I'm looking for work I can do at fair wages. I was quiet again. She noticed that he didn't fill silence reflexively the way anxious people did. He waited inside a silence until he had something he actually wanted to say. She found that she respected it. I don't know what fair wages are for a position I haven't posted, he said. Then let me suggest a number, and you can tell me if it's unreasonable. He looked at her. Go ahead. She named a figure. It was lower than she deserved, but it wasn't insultingly low, and it was calibrated specifically to land in the range where a man with his operation could say yes without feeling he'd been taken advantage of. She'd thought about this walking the 4 miles from town. He was quiet for a moment. That's less than I paid the last woman. It's a starting figure, she said. I expect we'll renegotiate after a month if you're satisfied with the work. And if I'm not satisfied, then you tell me and I correct whatever the problem is, she said. And if the problem isn't correctable, I leave. I don't expect guarantees I haven't earned yet. He uncrossed his arms. He sat down in the chair across from her, leaned back, and looked at her with something that was just beginning to be different from plain assessment. Most people who come out here looking for work want me to make a decision before they've done anything to deserve one, he said. I understand that, she said. I'm asking for a trial period, 3 months. At the end of it, you'll know what you have, and so will I. He was quiet for what felt like a long time. Outside, the rain was picking up again. She could hear it on the roof above them. There's a room at the back of the house, he said finally. It was the housekeeper's room. It's been empty 3 years. You'll have access to everything in the kitchen and the supply rooms. I expect a full accounting of the household inventory within the first week. He paused. I have 12 hands working this ranch and 2 kitchen helpers who come in from town 3 days a week. The rest of the time, the house management has been handled by whoever was willing to do it, which is to say, not well. Anna nodded. She was already cataloging what he'd told her, organizing the information into work she could see clearly in front of her. There are rules, he said. Tell me. I don't discuss ranch business at the dinner table, he said. I eat at 6 in the evening, and I don't want conversation about finances or problems with the hands while I'm eating. You can bring me anything in writing, and I'll read it, but not at the table. Understood. I'm up at 4:30 every morning. I don't expect breakfast before 5, and I don't expect company before 5 either. Also understood. I have guests occasionally, cattle buyers mostly. When I have guests, I expect the house to be presentable. I'll give you advance notice when I can. He paused. When I can't, I expect you to manage anyway. Yes. He looked at her for a moment longer. Do you have questions? 1, she said. The ledgers on your shelf, the supply ledgers. They're 2 years out of date. Are the current ones kept somewhere else, or have they simply not been updated? A pause. Not updated. Then I'll need the receipts from the past 2 years, whatever you've saved. I'll rebuild them from the beginning. He said nothing for a moment. Then, the receipts are in a box in the supply room. They're not organized. They don't need to be organized, Anna said. That's what I'm here for. He stood up. I'll have one of the hands show you the room. Thank you, Mr. Carter. He walked toward the door to the back hallway and stopped with his hand on the frame. He half-turned, not quite looking at her. I run this ranch because it was built on hard work, and I respect hard work, he said. I don't need people who need things from me. I need people who can do what they say they can do. I understand, Anna said. Good, he said. Then we understand each other. He walked out. Anna sat for a moment in the chair by the fireplace. She looked around the room. She looked at the dusty ledgers, the unused furniture, the desk with its years of untouched paper. Then she picked up her suitcase, stood up, and got to work. The first 3 days were harder than she'd let herself anticipate, not because of the work she'd expected. The work she was prepared for the work, and it was exactly as substantial as she'd calculated. The supply room alone represented nearly 18 months of unrecorded purchases, and she spent the better part of the first 2 days on her knees on the floor, sorting receipts and organizing them by date and category and vendor, working backward through the paper evidence of a ranch that had been operating on instinct and memory rather than documentation. It was the house itself that was harder than she'd expected. Not the physical space, the atmosphere. Benjamin Carter moved through his own home like a man who had learned to need very little from it. He ate at 6 every evening as promised, efficiently and without much interest in what was in front of him. He read at the table after dinner, a habit she noticed immediately, because most men she'd known treated reading at the dinner table as something shameful, a sign of a man who didn't have enough company to make conversation worth having. Benjamin Carter apparently had no such worry about what the habit suggested. I was not cold to her. He wasn't rude. He answered questions directly and completely, and he noticed she could tell. He noticed when she made a change that improved something. He simply didn't comment on it. He walked into the kitchen on the 3rd morning to find that she'd reorganized the food stores in a way that made the cooking helpers' work substantially more efficient, and he stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at it, and then he walked out without saying anything. She told herself it didn't matter whether he commented. She told herself she was here for the work. That was true. It was entirely true. But the silence of the house at night, the particular quality of emptiness in a place that had held people once and then lost them, that was harder than she'd prepared for. She'd been alone in a practical sense for a long time. Since her parents died, really, she'd been alone in the way that mattered. But this house had a different kind of emptiness. A chosen one. A deliberate one. She'd heard the story in town before she came out here. Everyone knew some version of it. Benjamin Carter's wife, a woman named Margaret, had died 6 years ago of a fever that came on quickly and killed her in less than a week. They'd been married 3 years. They'd had no children. And Benjamin Carter had closed the door on that part of his life so completely and so permanently that most people in Silver Creek had simply accepted that it was closed and stopped waiting for him to open it. She wasn't here to open it. She was very clear about that, both with herself and in the practical facts of her daily behavior. She did her work. She kept the house. She managed the records. She brought him reports in writing at times that didn't interrupt his meals. She was professional and efficient, and she kept a careful distance that communicated nothing beyond competence. But on the 5th day, something shifted. It shifted because of the accounts. She'd finished rebuilding the supply ledgers from the recovered receipts, and she had discovered in the process a pattern that she hadn't been looking for and wasn't sure she should mention. 3 of the regular vendors who supplied the ranch were billing at rates that were between 15% and 20% above what any comparable operation in the territory should have been paying. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the kind of thing you'd notice if you weren't looking specifically at comparative rates and tracking the cumulative cost over time. But over 18 months, the overcharging represented a significant sum. She sat with it for a day. She wasn't sure if it was her place to raise it. Then she decided that her place was precisely wherever her competence could do something useful, and she wrote it up in clear language and put it on his desk. He came to her that evening after dinner. He had the paper in his hand. "You found this in the supply records," he said. "Yes, sir." "You rebuilt the ledgers and then cross-referenced the rates." "Yes." He stood in the doorway of the kitchen, where she was making the next morning's bread, and he looked at the paper in his hand. "This is nearly $400 over the past 18 months. "A little more than that," she said. "Closer to 430. He was quiet. She kept working the dough in front of her, giving him space to think. "I've been dealing with Harlow's supply company for 6 years, he said finally. "Marcus Harlow shook my hand after Margaret's funeral and told me to tell him if I ever needed anything." She didn't say anything. He's been overcharging me for 18 months, Benjamin said. It was quiet and flat, and she heard inside it something beyond financial irritation. Something about the specific weight of discovering that a man who offered you kindness in grief had been taking advantage of it. I can be wrong, she said. I'd recommend verifying my calculations with someone independent. I'll do that, he said. He looked up from the paper. How long did this take you to find? I wasn't looking for it specifically, she said. It showed up when I organized everything chronologically and ran the rates against each other. He was quiet for another moment. Most people who kept these books for me wouldn't have noticed. Most people keeping these books weren't organizing them from the beginning, she said. Starting fresh made it easier to see the whole picture. He nodded once. He looked at her in a way that was different from the inventory look he'd given her on the porch. There was something in it that was less categorizing and more direct. Good work, he said. He walked out. She went back to the bread. She told herself it didn't mean anything that her hands weren't quite steady for the next few minutes. By the end of the second week, she had established a routine that worked. She was up before 5 earlier than he was, which she suspected surprised him, though he didn't mention it. She had the kitchen organized and breakfast underway before he came through. They ate in the same room, but not always at the same table. In those early mornings, she ate at the kitchen table while working. He took his coffee to the desk and read through the previous day's notes from the hands before heading out. It was not companionable in any warm sense. It was functional. But function was a kind of language she'd always understood, and she found that she could read Benjamin Carter more clearly through functional observation than she could through conversation. How was precise. He made decisions quickly and stuck to them unless the facts changed, at which point he adjusted without apparent difficulty or ego. He was fair to the ranch hands in a way that wasn't soft. He expected real work, and he monitored it. But when someone had a genuine problem, he dealt with it straightforwardly and without the kind of leverage some employers used. She heard him one afternoon through the open kitchen window talking to one of the younger hands, a boy who couldn't have been more than 17, and she heard the particular way he delivered a correction. Direct. Clear. Not cruel. The kind of correction that told you exactly what you'd done wrong and what you should do differently, without making you feel like a failure for having done it wrong in the first place. She filed that away. She filed a lot of things away in those early weeks. The confrontation with Marcus Harlow happened on a Thursday, 12 days after she'd put her findings on Benjamin's desk. She knew it was happening because she overheard the beginning of it from the hallway. Not intentionally, she'd been coming to bring Benjamin a copy of the revised supply contracts she'd drafted, and she stopped when she heard the raised voice coming from inside the office. Harlow's voice. Carter, I've been your supplier for 6 years. I don't know what this woman told you, but... Benjamin's voice not raised. She showed me documentation, Marcus. You want to look at the documentation? She's confused the accounts. She doesn't understand how supply pricing works. You bring in some stranger off the road, and she reorganizes your books, and now you're accusing me of... I'm not accusing you of anything, Benjamin said. I'm telling you what the numbers say. If there's an explanation, I'd like to hear it. A silence. Then Harlow's voice, lower now, shifted. I've had some additional costs this year. Freight rates went up. I had to adjust. The adjustments you made weren't applied to any of your other customers, Benjamin said. I asked around. Another silence. Longer. What do you want? Harlow said finally. A credit applied to my account for the difference, Benjamin said. And a corrected rate going forward. She didn't hear the rest. She stepped back quietly and went back to the kitchen. She was at the stove when she heard Harlow leave. She heard the front door, heard the horse in the yard, heard it move away. 15 minutes later, Benjamin came to the kitchen. He's going to apply the credit, he said. Good, she said. He stood near the doorway, the way he often did, like a man who made decisions about whether he was fully in a room before committing to it. She turned back to what she was working on. He called you a stranger off the road, Benjamin said. She paused. I heard part of it, she said. I wasn't listening deliberately. I know you weren't, he said. I'm not bringing it up because of that. He paused. He said it like it was a problem. A stranger. It's an accurate description, she said. It's only accurate for a few more days, he said. After that, you've been here long enough to know the place. She looked at him. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the far wall of the kitchen, the way men sometimes looked at things when they were saying something they weren't used to saying. I suppose that's right, she said. You did good work, he said. It came out differently than the first time he'd said it. Less evaluation. More something she didn't have a clean word for. I went back to the office. She stood in the kitchen for a moment and looked at the wall he'd been looking at. Then she picked up her work and kept going. The conversation she didn't expect happened at the end of the third week. It was late after dinner after he'd finished reading at the table and she'd cleared it and she'd thought he was done for the night. She was in the main room reading the following week's supply orders by the fireplace light, and he came back from the hallway and sat down in the chair across from her. She looked up. I didn't say anything immediately. He sat in that deliberate way he had, like he'd decided to do something and was letting the decision settle before he acted on it. You mentioned your father taught you to manage land, he said. Yes. What kind of man was he? She looked at him for a moment. The question was unexpected enough that she had to find the answer rather than simply locate it. How was practical, she said. He believed that the most important thing you could do was understand what you were working with, the land, the weather, the animals. He said you can't manage anything honestly if you're not willing to look at it straight. She paused. He wasn't a man who said much, but when he said something, it was worth hearing. Benjamin was quiet. Your father taught you accounting, he said. It wasn't quite a question. He taught me that knowing where every dollar went was the difference between a farm that lasted and a farm that didn't, she said. He turned out to be right. I just learned it too late to save ours. The fire moved between them. What was the debt from? He asked. If you're willing to say. She hadn't talked about this with anyone. The specific facts of what happened. She'd stated it plainly when she arrived, and she'd left it there because it was past, and she was trying to face forward. But there was something in the way he asked it. Quiet. No agenda. The same directness he brought to everything else. My father borrowed against the land twice during bad seasons, she said. I knew about the first loan. I didn't know about the second until after he died. He'd signed it the same year my mother got sick before she died, and I think he was trying to manage everything at once, and he didn't want me to know how bad it was. She paused. The lender he borrowed from the second time was not a man who was interested in waiting. When I inherited the land I inherited the debt and the interest on it had been running for 2 years by then. I held them off for another 2 years, but the math was already decided. Did you fight it legally? I consulted an attorney, she said. He told me the terms were harsh but legal. She looked at the fire. It's possible he was wrong, but I couldn't afford to find out. Benjamin was quiet for a while. My wife's father tried to buy this land from me 3 months after she died, he said. She looked at him. She hadn't expected that. He said it was too much for a man in grief to manage alone, he said. He said he was doing me a favor. A pause. He named a price that was about half what it was worth. What did you do? She said. I told him that I was going to stay on this land until I was carried off it, and that the next time he came to discuss the subject, I'd have nothing more to say to him. He stopped. He hasn't been back. She said nothing. People decide what they can take from you when they think you're weak, he said. It came out like something he'd arrived at over a long time. They look at what you're carrying, and they decide that the load is light enough for them to help themselves to part of it. Yes, she said quietly. He looked at her. Your father's lender. Yes, she said. Something passed between them that wasn't conversation. She didn't know what to call it. A recognition. The particular acknowledgement of two people who have been on the same side of a particular kind of experience. He stood up. Good night, Miss Whitaker, he said. Good night, Mr. Carter. He walked down the hallway. She sat by the fire for a long time after he left her work, forgotten in her lap, looking at the place where he'd been sitting. She told herself she was simply tired. She told herself that, and she didn't entirely believe it, and she went to bed anyway, and lay in the dark of the housekeeper's room, listening to the ranch settle around her, and thinking about a man who had kept his fencing in excellent condition for 6 years, while the inside of his house gathered dust, and what that meant about a person, and why it kept her awake far longer than it should have. She woke at 4:15 the next morning and lay still for a moment in the dark listening. The ranch was not silent at that hour. It had its own language at 4 in the morning, the shift of horses in the barn, the creak of the bunkhouse settling in the cold, the distant sound of wind working its way across open ground. She'd grown up in a farmhouse that made the same kinds of sounds, and she'd always found them grounding rather than unsettling. The sounds of a working place, a place that didn't stop being alive just because the people in it were sleeping. She got up dressed quickly and went to the kitchen. She was mixing biscuit dough when she heard his boots in the hallway. Earlier than 5. She glanced at the clock on the shelf. 4:48. He stopped in the kitchen doorway. He looked at her, then at the dough, then at the coffee already sitting on the stove. "You're up early," he said. "So are you," she said. He came in, poured himself a cup of coffee, and leaned against the far counter. Not at the desk, not in the doorway. In the kitchen itself, which was different from every other morning. She kept working the dough and didn't remark on it. "I've been thinking about what you said last night," he said. "About the attorney. The one who told you the terms were legal." She paused only briefly. "What about it?" "There are attorneys in Denver who handle land cases specifically," he said. "I've dealt with a few of them on ranch business. If you have documentation from the original transaction, it might be worth a second opinion." She set the dough aside and turned to look at him. "It's been 7 months since I lost the land. That doesn't necessarily make it unreclaimable," he said. "Depending on how the debt was structured and whether there were any irregularities in the original loan, there may be grounds to challenge the terms, or at minimum, the interest calculation." He looked at his coffee. "I'm not an attorney. I'm saying it might be worth the conversation." She was quiet. She hadn't let herself think about this. She'd filed it away in the category of things that were finished, because thinking about things that were finished and that you couldn't change was the fastest way to lose your footing on what was in front of you. "Why are you telling me this?" she said. He looked up. "Because you found me $430, he said. "And because the man who told you nothing could be done may have been wrong or may have had a reason to tell you nothing could be done." The second part of that sentence landed with a specific weight. "You think the attorney may have had a connection to the lender," she said. "I think it's a question worth asking," he said. She turned back to the dough. Her hands moved, but her mind was somewhere in Kansas, standing in a lawyer's office in Dodge City, while a man in a gray suit explained to her in patient, final-sounding language why the situation was what it was. She'd believed him. She'd been exhausted and grieving, and she'd believed him because she hadn't had the resources to disbelieve him. "I'll think about it," she said finally. "Fair enough," he said. I took his coffee and went to the desk. She heard the familiar sounds of him settling into the morning's work, the rustling of papers, the scratch of a pen, the ordinary routine of it. But something had shifted, and she felt it in the room like a change in pressure. He'd given her something this morning. Not charity, not sympathy. The specific kind of practical action that said, "I see a problem you haven't addressed, and I think you should address it." That was how her father had expressed care. Through functionality. Through looking at a situation and finding the thing that could be done. She put the biscuits in the oven and didn't say anything else. But when she set his breakfast on the desk 20 minutes later, she said, "I have the original loan documents. I kept everything." He looked up. "Good," he said. "Keep them somewhere safe." That was all. He went back to reading. She went back to the kitchen. She stood at the window for a moment and looked at the yard where the hands were starting to appear in the early light, moving between the barn and the bunkhouse, the day beginning in its incremental way. She thought about the gray-suited attorney in Dodge City. She thought about the particular sympathy in his voice, the way he'd explained everything so thoroughly, so carefully, as though he genuinely regretted that nothing could be done. She thought about what Benjamin Carter had just said. "May have had a reason to tell you nothing could be done." She filed it away. Carefully this time. in a different category than before. The week that followed was the week she started to understand the ranch. Not the paperwork. She'd understood the paperwork from the beginning. The operational reality. The specific relationships between people and land and livestock that made a ranch something beyond an economic enterprise. She understood it because she'd been raised around it, but every operation had its own particular character, and Carter Ranch was becoming legible to her in a way she hadn't expected so quickly. She understood, for instance, that the relationship between Benjamin and his foreman, a man named Clem Dawson, was the structural center of everything the ranch functioned on. Clem was in his mid-50s, lean and weathered and quiet, in a way that was completely different from Benjamin's quiet. Where Benjamin's silence was chosen, contained, controlled. Clem's silence was the silence of a man who simply didn't find words useful for most things. He communicated in short, declarative sentences and an economy of gesture that the hands had learned to read fluently over years. He did not know what to do with Anna. She recognized this immediately. It wasn't hostility exactly. It was the wariness of a man whose operation had an established order and who was waiting to see where a new element landed before deciding what to do with it. She'd dealt with this her whole life. Men who needed to categorize her before they could interact with her, and who found her difficult to categorize because she didn't fit the available boxes cleanly. She dealt with it the way she always dealt with it. She learned what he needed, and she made sure it was available. Within the first week, she'd noticed that the supply order for the bunkhouse, the one she was managing now, had been consistently short on the coffee Clem preferred, and consistently long on a brand of tobacco that nobody actually used. She corrected this without mentioning it to anyone. When she did, Clem looked at the supply shelf with an expression she couldn't read, and then he looked at her with the same expression, and then he went back to work. The next morning he said, "The coffee was right," as he walked through the kitchen. "Good," she said. He didn't say anything else. But after that, the wariness in his silences had a different texture. The hands were a more varied equation. There were 12 of them, ranging in age from the 17-year-old boy she'd heard Benjamin correct, whose name was Danny, all the way to a man named Ortega, who was close to 60 and had worked the ranch for 15 years. They had established relationships with each other, and with Benjamin, and with the ranch itself, and she moved through their world carefully in those first weeks, learning names and dynamics and the specific tensions that ran between certain people without resolving. There was one hand a man named Cole Reardon who was a problem. She'd identified this on the second day without looking for it. Cole was in his late 20s, good-looking in the way that men sometimes were when the looks arrived ahead of the character, and he had a manner with authority that she recognized as specifically provisional. He followed it when there was no good alternative, and looked for alternatives whenever one appeared. He was skilled enough at his work that removing him would have cost the ranch something real, and he knew that, and it sat underneath everything he did, like a foundation he'd decided he could rely on indefinitely. He didn't like her. She knew this within 24 hours. It wasn't personal dislike exactly. It was that her presence and the competence of her presence reorganized a set of assumptions he'd been operating on, and people like Cole Reardon did not reorganize their assumptions without resistance. The first direct incident happened on the 10th day. She'd been reviewing the supply order for the coming week, and she'd found a significant discrepancy in the feed consumption records. The numbers that had been recorded didn't match the actual inventory she'd counted, and the gap was large enough that it wasn't bookkeeping error. Feed was missing, a substantial quantity of it. She brought it to Benjamin in writing as she always did, and he read it the same afternoon. That evening, he had a conversation with Clem that she wasn't present for. The next morning, Cole Reardon was called to the office. She was in the kitchen when he passed through. He looked at her as he went by, and the look was not subtle. It was the look of a man who had just been made to account for something, and who had decided in the way that certain men made such decisions that the accounting was her fault, rather than the behavior that had made it necessary. She held his gaze for exactly as long as it took to communicate that she wasn't going to look away first, and then she went back to what she was doing. He came out of the office 30 minutes later and went back to the yard without passing through the kitchen again. Benjamin came to her that evening. "The feed discrepancy," he said. "It was Reardon." "I thought it might be," she said. I was selling it privately to a man who runs a small operation about 8 miles east, skimming off the quantities and covering the records. He paused. Or trying to cover them. How long has it been going on? Probably 4 months, maybe longer before the records got complicated. He looked at her. You found it in 2 weeks. I had a clean start, she said again. It's easier to see things when you haven't been looking at them so long they become normal. I was quiet for a moment. I kept Reardon on, he said. He's good with the cattle, but he knows why he's still here and on what terms. That's your decision to make, she said. I'm not questioning it. I know you're not, he said. I'm telling you because you should know the situation. That was new. That wasn't just giving her information she needed to do her job. That was treating her as someone who had standing and understanding how things on the ranch stood. She recognized it. She didn't comment on it. Thank you, she said. Cole Reardon didn't look at her the same way after that. The hostility was still there, but it had changed shape. It had become careful. The look of a man who had recalibrated the cost of a particular kind of antagonism. She was not fooled by it, but she could work around careful. It was at the end of the 4th week that the first real thaw happened, though she didn't see it coming. She'd been working late, which was not unusual. The week's accounts were behind because a cattle buyer had come through on Wednesday and Thursday, and the household had needed to absorb 2 additional people for meals, and the complication of that had pushed the regular work to the evenings. She didn't mind. She preferred to have a clear surface before she slept. It was past 9 when she finished. The house was quiet. She'd thought Benjamin was in bed. She went to the kitchen to put water on for tea, and she found him sitting at the kitchen table. Not at the desk. Not in the main room with his reading. At the kitchen table, which was where she worked, where the cooking helpers sat when they came, where Danny sometimes ate in the early morning before anyone else was up because he was 17 and perpetually hungry. He had a glass of whiskey in front of him, and he wasn't reading anything. She stopped in the doorway. He looked up. He didn't seem particularly surprised to see her, which meant he'd heard her working and had expected her to come through. I didn't know you were still up, she said. Sit down, he said. If you want. She put the water on, and then she sat across from him at the kitchen table. He turned the glass slowly between his hands without drinking from it. She'd noticed he did that. He poured himself a glass sometimes, and then held it rather than drinking it like the ritual of pouring was the thing he needed, and the whiskey itself was incidental. Wilder made an offer today, he said. Wilder was one of the cattle buyers who'd been through that week. Good offer. Better than what I expected from him. I know, she said. I filed his paperwork. What did you think of the terms? She looked at him. He was asking her opinion on a business decision. A real one. Not what she thought about household management or supply orders. An operational question about the ranch. The price is fair, she said carefully. The payment schedule is the part I'd negotiate. He wants 60 days on the final portion. You could push for 45 without losing the deal. He wants those cattle, and he's not going to walk away over 15 days. He looked at her. You read his offer that closely, he said. I read everything that comes across the desk closely, she said. It's how I do the accounts properly. A pause. You're right about the 45 days, he said. I was thinking the same thing. She got up to check the water. You could have said that to me at dinner, he said, without a written report. You said you didn't want to discuss ranch business at the dinner table, she said. I said I didn't want to discuss problems at the dinner table, he said. An opinion about a business deal isn't a problem. She turned from the stove and looked at him. I'll remember that distinction. Good, he said. She made her tea and sat back down, and they sat across from each other in the kitchen while the house settled around them. It was not uncomfortable. It was something she didn't have an immediate word for. Companionable, maybe, though that word felt slightly too warm for what they actually were. Adjacent. 2 people in the same room with a specific quiet between them that had stopped being awkward sometime in the last 2 weeks without either of them deciding it. The man Wilder travels with, Benjamin said. His associate. Did you speak with him? Briefly, she said. Why? He was asking about you. I noticed. She wrapped her hands around her teacup. What did he want to know? Whether you were here permanently, Benjamin said. He said it without inflection, like a factual report. What did you tell him? I told him you were employed here, and the arrangement was working out well. A pause. He seemed to find that interesting. She looked at him. He was looking at the glass he was turning. Do you know what he was actually asking? She said. I have a general idea, Benjamin said. Yes. And I told him you were employed here, he said again. Flat, definitive. The tone of a statement that was also a border. She felt something she recognized as complicated and set it aside. Thank you, she said. No need, he said. He finished his whiskey, or what was left of it, stood up and said good night, the same way he always said it, straightforwardly and without embellishment. She said good night back. After he left, she sat at the kitchen table for a few minutes more, her hands around the cup. She thought about the border in his voice when he said it. The way it was definitive without being possessive. He wasn't claiming her. He was simply making clear with the particular economy he brought to everything that she was not available to be taken from the context she was in. She told herself she was analyzing it practically. She told herself it correctly. The first conversation that broke through the professional surface happened 2 days later, and it happened because of something small. She was reorganizing the shelf near the fireplace, the one with the books and the few decorative items that had accumulated on it without any logic to their arrangement, and she knocked something off. It hit the floor, and she picked it up before it could break, but when she turned it over in her hands, she realized it was a small framed photograph. The woman in it was younger than Anna, with a direct gaze and a slight smile that suggested the expression was natural rather than performed for the photograph. She was pretty. Not dramatically so. The kind of pretty that came from how someone held themselves as much as from the features themselves. Anna set it carefully back on the shelf, and she was stepping back when she heard him in the doorway behind her. She turned. He was looking at the shelf. At the photograph. I'm sorry, she said. I nearly knocked it. I should have been more careful with that shelf. He walked past her and looked at the photograph for a moment without picking it up. Then he said, That was Margaret. She didn't say anything. She wasn't sure what was appropriate. It was taken the summer before we married, he said. She hated having her photograph taken. I bribed her with a piece of pie from the bakery in town. She stood still for exactly as long as was necessary, and then she ate the pie and told me she hoped I was satisfied with the result. It was the most words she'd heard him say at once that were not about ranch business. She sounds like someone who knew her own mind, Anna said carefully. She did, he said. He looked at the photograph for another moment, and then he stepped back from the shelf. He looked at Anna. She would have liked you, he said. She had very little patience for people who didn't do things directly, and you don't do anything indirectly. Anna felt something shift in her chest that she didn't let reach her face. That's a kind thing to say. It's an accurate thing to say, he said. There's a difference. He walked out of the room. She stood for a moment facing the shelf. She looked at the small framed photograph of a woman who had known her own mind and died young and left a man alone in a house that gathered dust around his grief. She turned around and went back to work. But that evening at dinner, he said something that had nothing to do with the ranch or the accounts or any practical matter at all. He said, You mentioned your father had a saying about understanding what you're working with. Did he have others? She looked up genuinely startled. Several, she said. Tell me one, he said. It was not a command. It was the closest thing to a request she'd heard from him that was purely about conversation. About her. She thought for a moment. He used to say that the most dangerous thing a person could believe was that the situation they were in was the situation they were stuck in. She paused. He said the situation is always moving whether you move it or not, so you might as well decide the direction. Benjamin was quiet for a moment. Your father was a practical philosopher, he said. He would have hated that description, she said. He thought philosophy was something people did instead of working. Something happened on Benjamin's face then. Something that came and went quickly enough that she might have missed it if she hadn't been watching. It was not quite a smile. It was the shape of one. The warm ghost of the reflex. She looked back down at her food. Her heart was doing something entirely unnecessary, and she made it stop. The crisis that changed everything between them arrived not with any particular drama of its own, but through the accumulated pressure of 6 weeks of proximity, and it arrived in the form of Cole Reardon, which she should have anticipated. It was a Wednesday late afternoon. Benjamin was out on the North Range checking on the cattle that had been moved there the previous week. Clem was with him. The hands were spread across various parts of the operation, and she was in the supply room doing inventory when she heard someone come in behind her. She turned. Cole Reardon stood in the doorway of the supply room. I wasn't holding anything. He wasn't there for a reason that had any of the usual accompanying signals. He was simply there in a space she was in alone, looking at her with a look she knew how to read, and had been hoping not to have to read. "Afternoon," he said. "Afternoon," she said. She turned back to the shelf and continued counting. "You've been busy," he said. "I usually am," she said. He came into the room. Not quickly. The deliberate slow move of a man who was making a point with his physicality. She kept counting. "You've made a lot of changes around here," he said. "Some folks don't think all the changes have been necessary." "Some folks are welcome to take that up with Mr. Carter," she said evenly. "Mr. Carter's not here right now," he said. She put down what she was holding and turned around. She looked at him directly. She was not going to have this conversation with her back to him. "Mr. Reardon," she said, "I have a lot of work to finish before dinner. If you have a specific concern about ranch operations, please put it in writing, and I'll address it formally. If you don't have a specific concern about ranch operations, I'd appreciate the space." He looked at her. He was smiling now slightly the way certain men smiled when they thought they'd found an edge. "You talk like you own the place," he said. "I talk like someone who has a job to do," she said. "Same as you." He took one step closer. "The difference is, I've been here 5 years, and you've been here 6 weeks. "That's true," she said. "And in 6 weeks I found the feed discrepancy that cost you a conversation with Mr. Carter. So I suppose the question is whether you'd like another conversation like that, or whether we're going to proceed professionally." The smile went away. She held his gaze, and did not move, and did not let anything in her face communicate that she was particularly concerned about the 18 inches of space between them. The silence lasted long enough to mean something. Then Cole Reardon stepped back. One step, then another. The anger in his face settled into something colder and more careful, which she was actually less comfortable with than the anger, but she kept her face exactly where it was. "Professional," he said. "Sure." He walked out. She stood in the supply room for a moment after he left. Her hands were completely steady. She noticed this with mild surprise. She picked up the inventory she'd set down and kept counting. She didn't tell Benjamin what happened. She told herself she didn't tell him because it was handled and there was no useful information to add to what he already knew about Cole Reardon. This was true. It was also not the entire reason. The entire reason was that she didn't want to put herself in the position of needing Benjamin Carter to handle something on her behalf that she was capable of handling herself. Her independence was not a performance. It was structural. It was the thing that had kept her upright through everything, and she wasn't going to compromise it by turning every difficulty into something that required a man to solve. She handled it. She moved on. But 2 days later, Benjamin said to her at breakfast, "Reardon came to the supply room Wednesday." She looked up. He was looking at her steadily. He wasn't angry. His voice was the same as always, level and direct, but there was something underneath it. "Danny told me," he said. "He saw Reardon go in when I wasn't here. He said Reardon was in there for about 5 minutes alone with you." Danny. The 17-year-old boy who ate breakfast early and noticed things, and apparently had decided she was worth protecting in whatever way a 17-year-old could manage. "It was handled," she said. "I don't doubt it was," Benjamin said. "I'd like to know how," she told him. Straightforwardly, and without softening the part about Reardon's physical positioning or the specific threat of it. She told it the way she told him about supply discrepancies. The facts, the response, the outcome. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You should have told me," he said. "It was handled," she said again. "Anna," he said. It was the first time he'd used her name. Not Miss Whitaker. Her name. And the way it came out tight and controlled, and underneath the control, a wire pulled taut, told her that what he was feeling was not professional concern. She looked at him. "It was handled," she said more quietly this time. He understood the terms. "I don't believe he'll make the same calculation again." Benjamin stood up from the table. He walked to the window. His hands were at his sides. "He's gone," he said. She blinked. "Reardon." "I let him go this morning," Benjamin said. He was looking out the window. "He was told he could find employment elsewhere." She sat with that for a moment. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes," he said. "I did." He turned from the window and looked at her. Something was moving behind his expression that he wasn't releasing. She could see him holding it, containing it with the same deliberate control he applied to everything. "You are employed on this ranch," he said, "and people on this ranch are not treated that way. That's not about you specifically. That's how it works here." "I understand," she said. He nodded once. He picked up his coffee. He went to the desk. She sat at the breakfast table and looked at her hands. He'd said it wasn't about her specifically. She believed that. She also believed with the precision of a woman who had spent 6 weeks learning to read a man through the accumulated data of his behavior that he had not fired Cole Reardon strictly because of policy. She let that thought go. Carefully. Like releasing something before it had a chance to take hold. She got up, cleared the table, and went to work. That afternoon, she sat down and wrote a letter to an attorney's office in Denver. The one Benjamin had mentioned without quite mentioning it that first morning in the kitchen. She wrote it carefully and completely laying out the facts of her father's land, the original loan, the debt terms, the timeline. She enclosed it in an envelope and gave it to Danny to take to town with the outgoing mail. She didn't tell Benjamin she'd done it. She didn't know why exactly, except that it felt like a thing she needed to do on her own. But that evening when they sat at the dinner table, and he asked her what she'd accomplished that day, and she gave him the ordinary answer about accounts and orders, she was aware of the letter making its way toward a postal route to Denver, and she was aware of him across the table, and she was aware that she was in a territory of feeling that she had not mapped and did not have good tools for navigating. She was also aware with the same precision that she'd brought to every other assessment she'd made since arriving at Carter Ranch that he was in the same territory. Neither of them said a word about it. They finished dinner. He read at this table. She cleared it around him and said goodnight and went to the housekeeper's room at the back of the house. She lay in the dark for a long time. Outside somewhere on the North Range, a coyote called once and then went silent. The ranch settled into the sounds of its own breathing around her. She was still awake when the clock in the main room struck 11. The letter came back from Denver 3 weeks after she sent it. She recognized the envelope when Danny brought the mail in from town, the return address from the law office of Harding and Cole, printed in clean type on the upper left corner. She took it without saying anything and put it in her apron pocket and finished the task she was working on before she allowed herself to open it. She waited until she was alone in the supply room. She sat on the stool she kept there, and she opened the envelope carefully and read the letter twice. The attorney, a man named George Harding, wrote in clear and precise language that was nothing like the gray-suited man in Dodge City. He wrote that based on the facts she had outlined, there were significant questions about the legality of the interest calculation applied to her father's second loan. He wrote that the rate charged exceeded the territorial limit set by statute in 1873 by a margin that was not ambiguous. He wrote that the timeline of her father's death and the subsequent acceleration of the debt, combined with the rate irregularity, constituted grounds for a formal challenge. He wrote that he would need to see the original documents to proceed, but that his preliminary assessment was that she had a case. She sat with the letter in her hands for a long time. 7 months. She had been carrying weight of that lost land for 7 months, telling herself it was finished, telling herself she had to face forward. And the truth was that a man in Dodge City had either been wrong or had lied to her. And George Harding in Denver believed she could get it back. She folded the letter, put it back in the envelope, and put the envelope in the pocket of her apron. Then she sat on the stool for another minute breathing. She didn't cry. She'd learned not to cry over things until she knew what they actually meant, because preliminary news was not the same as resolved news, and the distance between those two things was where most of the hard work lived. But her hands shook slightly as she went back to the main house. Benjamin was at the desk when she came through. He looked up. He looked at her the way he'd learned to look at her in the past weeks, with the specific attention of a man who had started paying attention to the information available in another person's expression. "What happened?" he said. She hadn't planned to tell him immediately. She'd planned to think it through, to organize the information to come to him with a clear presentation of the facts and what they meant practically. What she did instead was take the letter out of her apron pocket and set it on the desk in front of him. He read it. He read it once quickly, and then he read it again more slowly. She stood and watched his face, and saw the moment he understood what it meant. He set the letter down. "The attorney in Dodge City told you nothing could be done," he said. "Yes. I was wrong, or he was dishonest," Benjamin said. The flatness in his voice had a particular quality. The quality of a man who understood exactly what it meant when someone used another person's grief and exhaustion as a tool. "I don't know which yet," she said. "But it doesn't change the current situation." "No," he said. "It doesn't." He leaned back in his chair. "You'll need to send Harding the original documents. Do you want me to have them transported safely? I can arrange for a courier rather than the postal route. Less risk." She looked at him. "You don't need to do that." "I know I don't need to," he said. "Do you want me to?" She thought about independence. She thought about the careful distance she'd maintained between what she accepted from him and what she didn't. Then she thought about a box of irreplaceable documents traveling on a postal route through rough country. "Yes," she said. "Thank you." He nodded once. "I'll arrange it tomorrow." She picked the letter up from the desk. She was about to go back to the kitchen when he said, "Anna." She turned. Howe was looking at her. Something in his face that was not his usual containment. Something closer to the surface. "I'm glad you sent the letter," he said. She held his gaze for a moment. "So am I," she said. She went back to the kitchen. She stood at the counter and pressed both her palms flat against the wood and breathed. She told herself very firmly that she was not going to make anything out of the way. He'd said her name this time. She told herself this 3 times with increasing conviction and believed it less each time. The documents went to Denver by courier, 4 days later, wrapped carefully and sealed and carried by a man Benjamin trusted who was heading there on other ranch business anyway. She watched them go with the feeling of a person releasing something important into uncertain air and hoping the wind was right. The waiting was harder than she'd expected, not because she had nothing else to think about. She had plenty. The ranch was moving into a busy period as the late summer work intensified, and the demands on her time were real and substantial. She managed the household through 2 more cattle buyer visits, renegotiated 3 supply contracts with the information she'd gathered from the first month's work, and helped Clem organize the rotation schedule for the coming season in a way that reduced overlap and improved coverage. Clem thanked her for this by saying nothing, and then 3 days later bringing her a jar of the honey his wife produced on their property south of town. She accepted it without comment. They understood each other, but underneath all of it, the waiting ran like a low current. The knowledge that somewhere in Denver, a man named George Harding was reading through her father's papers and deciding whether the thing she'd been told was lost was actually lost. Benjamin didn't ask her about it. He simply, in the specific way she'd learned to recognize, made things easier in the margins. The courier arrangements had been made without fanfare. A week after the documents went, he mentioned offhandedly that he knew a judge in the territorial circuit who dealt with land cases and who could be consulted informally if the Denver situation required it. He said it as a fact. Not an offer requiring acknowledgement, just a piece of information she might find useful, placed in her vicinity, like a tool set on a workbench. She was beginning to understand how he cared about things. It was not through words. It was not through demonstration. It was through the consistent quiet arrangement of circumstances into slightly better configurations without calling attention to the arrangement. Her father had been the same way. She told herself the comparison was irrelevant. She did not fully convince herself. The storm arrived on a Thursday night in late August. It came from the northwest, which in that part of the territory meant it came fast, and it came with intention. The hands had known it was coming since mid-afternoon, the particular quality of the sky, and the behavior of the cattle, signaling what experienced people knew how to read. And by the time the sun went down, every man on the ranch was doing the work of securing what needed to be secured. Anna had dinner ready at the usual time, but ate alone. Benjamin was out with Clem and the hands assessing the situation on the North Range where the cattle had been moved 2 weeks ago. She cleaned up the kitchen, and then she stood listening to the wind pick up outside, and she thought about the cattle on the North Range and the men out in it, and she put on her coat. She was crossing the yard when Danny found her. "Miss Whitaker," he said. He was breathing hard. "Mr. Carter said for everyone to stay inside." "What's happening on the North Range?" she said. "The fence on the east side gave way in one section. The cattle are trying to drift and the men are working to hold them, but it's getting bad and—" She was already moving. "Miss Whitaker." "I heard you," she said. "Go back to the bunkhouse and get the 2 men who are still there. Tell them the east fence needs hands and come now." "But Mr. Carter said—" "Mr. Carter said for everyone to stay inside. I'm telling you to get those men and come to the East Range. Those are 2 different instructions from 2 different people, and you need to decide which one makes more sense given what you just told me." She looked at him. "Move." Danny moved. She went to the North Range. She found the situation was worse than Danny had described. The section of east fence that had given was not a small failure. A post had gone down in the wind, taking 40 feet of wire with it, and the cattle in the vicinity had already found the gap. Clem had 2 men working the near side, trying to hold the main herd from following, while Benjamin and 2 other hands were out further working to turn the animals that had already drifted. The rain started as she arrived. Clem saw her. His expression, even in the dark, and the rain, and the noise of stressed cattle communicated a full sentence of opinion about her presence. She ignored it and went to where the post was down. She'd repaired fence on her father's farm since she was 12 years old. She knew what a post needed, and she knew how to work wire in bad conditions, and she knew that 40 feet of downed wire in a storm with cattle on both sides of it was a problem that required hands, regardless of whose hands they were. She worked. Danny arrived with the 2 men from the bunkhouse 10 minutes later. She directed them without hesitation. She knew where the anchor needed to be. She knew which side the wire had to come from, and she knew that the most important thing in that moment was not getting it perfect, but getting it solid enough to hold until the storm broke. They got it solid. The far side, his voice carrying in the wind, the specific tone of a man directing animals, through a combination of sound and pressure and knowledge of how they moved when frightened. She didn't go out to where he was. She held the repaired section with Clem's men and kept the main herd from following the ones that had drifted. It took 2 hours. By the time Benjamin came back with the drifted cattle, and the hands who had been working with him the fence was holding, and the rain had settled from the initial violent surge to a steady hard fall. She was soaked through, and her hands were cut in 2 places from the wirework, not seriously, but enough that she felt it when she closed her fingers. He came up to where she was standing. He looked at her. She looked back at him. "Danny said you ordered him to get the bunkhouse men," he said. "I did. I told everyone to stay inside." "You told everyone to stay inside before you knew the east fence was down," she said. "The calculation changed." He was still looking at her. She could see him working through it, the anger that had started forming when he came back and saw her there, and what it was moving into, now that he was standing in front of her, and seeing the repaired fence, and the held herd, and the wire cuts on her hands. "You knew how to do this," he said. "My father's farm had fence," she said, "and storms." He looked at her hands. He didn't say anything for a moment. "Clem," he said without looking away from her. "Yes, sir," Clem said from a few feet away. "Get the men in. Get them warm and fed. I'll do the final check on the north section. Sir, Clem said. And then, which she did not miss, he said it without any of the tone that would have accompanied it 2 months ago, without the reservation. Like a man who had updated his assessment and was comfortable with the update. Benjamin looked at her. Go inside, he said. Get warm. Those cuts need to be cleaned. I'm fine, she said. I know you're fine, he said. Go inside anyway. The firmness in it was not the firmness of a man giving an order. It was the firmness of a man who was dealing with something that was making him unsteady and was managing it the only way he knew how. She went inside. She cleaned the cuts and changed out of her wet clothes, and she was sitting at the kitchen table with her hands around a cup of hot coffee when he came back inside an hour later. He came into the kitchen. He was soaked and tired, and he moved with the particular heaviness of a man who had been pushing his body hard for several hours. He saw her at the table, and he stopped. You should be in bed, he said. I was waiting, she said. Then, because the honest version of it was more accurate, I wanted to know the cattle were all in. He poured himself a cup of coffee and sat down across from her at the kitchen table. They sat in silence for a while. Outside, the rain was easing. The storm had spent itself. He looked at her hands around the cup. Let me see, he said. They're fine. Anna. She put her hands on the table. He reached across and turned them palm up. He looked at the cuts, 2 lines across her right palm and 1 across the left. The wire marks she'd gotten working in the dark. He pressed lightly along each one, not painfully checking. His hands were calloused and warm and completely certain in their movement. They're clean, she said. They are, he agreed. He didn't let go of her hands immediately. The kitchen was very quiet. I was looking at her hands. Then he looked up, and he was looking at her face. The distance between them across the table was not very much distance at all. She felt the exact moment when the air in the room changed. She'd been feeling it building for weeks. This specific pressure, the accumulated weight of 2 people in proximity who were both committed to not acknowledging what was accumulating. She'd managed it by staying on her side of it, by treating every moment that came close to the edge as a practical matter rather than an emotional one. He released her hands. He sat back. He picked up his coffee. You fought that fence like you'd been doing it your whole life, he said. His voice was slightly different, still controlled, still his. But the control was costing him something she could hear. I have been doing it most of my life, she said. Most ranchers' wives can't say that, he said. He said it looking at the table, not at her. She felt it land in her chest like something dropped from a height. Neither of them spoke for a moment. I didn't mean, he started. I know, she said. The silence after that was different from all the previous silences. It was not comfortable. It was not the silence of 2 people who had arrived at an understanding. It was the silence of 2 people standing on opposite sides of something they had just made real by speaking near it. He stood up. She stood up. They were both standing in the kitchen at 1 a.m, soaked exhaustion behind them, and something entirely else in front of them, and neither of them moved. Benjamin, she said. It was the first time she'd used his name without the Mr. attached. She heard it come out of her mouth, and she couldn't recall deciding to say it. He looked at her. She held his gaze. She didn't look away. She didn't provide him with the exit she'd been providing both of them for weeks. She stood still, and she let him see what was in her face, because she was tired of the careful management of it, because she had spent 6 weeks being precise and controlled, and she had earned. She felt in that moment a minute of honesty. He took 1 step toward her. Then he stopped. He ran his hand over his face, the gesture of a man checking himself, pulling himself back from an edge by force of habit, so old it operated automatically. You work for me, he said. It came out rough. I'm aware of that, she said. If something, he stopped. He stopped again. She watched him struggle with it. She didn't help him. She'd been helping both of them avoid this for 6 weeks, and she was done helping. I don't want you to feel that you have to. He stopped a 3rd time. Benjamin, she said. I have been making my own decisions my entire life. I don't feel I have to do anything. If you're asking whether what you think you see is real, the answer is yes. If you're asking whether it changes what you want, that's your question to answer, not mine. He looked at her for a long moment. He said, "It changes what I want." The space between them was still there. He didn't cross it. But the quality of it had changed entirely. It was no longer a managed distance. It was something held open by the same deliberateness he applied to everything, the same patience, the choice of a man who understood that some things done wrong couldn't be undone. "I need to think," he said. "All right," she said. "Not because I'm not." He stopped. "I know," she said. "I understand." He nodded. He picked up his coffee cup, looked at it, set it back down. He looked at her once more, directly the way he looked at things he was serious about, and then he went down the hallway. She stood in the kitchen for a while. She pressed one hand flat against the table, the right one, the one with the cuts from the wire. She felt the slight sting of it, and was grateful for the physical fact of it, for something that was clear and present and real. She went to bed. She did not sleep for a very long time. The next morning was the hardest morning on the ranch so far, not because of the storm's aftermath, though there was plenty of that. Not because of the practical work that came with assessing damage and organizing repairs. But because she and Benjamin moved through the same house and the same routines with the knowledge of the night before between them, solid and undeniable, and neither of them knew yet what to do with it. Howe was at the desk when she came to the kitchen. He looked up when she came through. He looked at her the same way he always looked at her. Direct. Present. But there was something underneath it now that had not been there before. Or rather, something that had been there and was now no longer hidden. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. She made coffee. She made breakfast. She set his plate on the desk the way she always did. He ate and read his notes from the night's damage assessment the same as every morning. But when he left to go out with Clem, he stopped in the doorway and said, "The cuts are better." "Yes," she said. He nodded. He left. She stood in the kitchen and told herself that normal was fine, that normal was something she could work with, that the conversation they'd had was not a beginning of something so much as an acknowledgement of something, and acknowledgement didn't require immediate action. She believed this until mid-afternoon. Mid-afternoon was when Danny came running back from the South Road with news that nobody on the ranch had been expecting. He burst into the kitchen out of breath with the specific energy of a 17-year-old who was carrying information that felt enormous. "Miss Whitaker," he said. "There's a man at the gate. He's asking for Mr. Carter. He says his name is Whitfield. He says he's from the Cattlemen's Association in the territory, and he says—" Danny stopped to catch his breath. "He says he has documents about the ranch, about the title to Carter Ranch." She set down what she was holding. "Go get Mr. Carter from the Northfield," she said. "Quickly." Danny went. She untied her apron and went to the gate. The man at the gate was in his 50s, well dressed in the way that suggested institutional money rather than personal wealth, carrying a leather case that had official handles on it. He introduced himself as Harold Whitfield, Senior Representative of the Territorial Cattlemen's Association, and he shook her hand with the brisk efficiency of a man who was accustomed to being received formally. "I'm the ranch housekeeper," she said. "Mr. Carter has been sent for. Can I ask the nature of your business?" He looked at her with the mild assessment of a man deciding how much to say to someone he considered peripheral. "It relates to the ranch title," he said. "There's a competing claim that's been filed. I'm here to notify Mr. Carter and give him an opportunity to respond before the matter is put before the Territorial Land Board." She kept her face entirely still. "A competing claim," she said. "Filed by whom?" "I'm not at liberty to discuss the specifics with anyone other than Mr. Carter," he said. "Not unkindly, just definitively." She nodded. "Of course," she said. "He'll be here shortly. Please come inside." She brought him to the main room, and she went to the kitchen, and she stood at the counter, and she thought very quickly. A competing claim on Carter Ranch, filed with the Territorial Land Board. The timing coming 3 days after Cole Reardon had been let go, 6 weeks after she'd begun reorganizing the ranch's financial records, 2 weeks after she'd sent documents to Denver about her own land case. She didn't know yet if the timing meant anything, but she'd learned from her father that when things happened in sequence, sequence was a fact worth examining. She was still at the counter thinking when she heard the front door open and Benjamin's voice, and then Whitfield's. She went to the doorway of the main room. Benjamin was reading the document Whitfield had placed in his hands. She watched his face. She saw the exact moment he understood what it said. His expression didn't change dramatically, but it changed a specific stillness that was different from his ordinary stillness, the stillness of a man absorbing a blow. He looked up from the document. He looked directly at her. "Anna," he said, "come in here." Whitfield looked at her with mild surprise. "She stays," Benjamin said. He didn't look at Whitfield when he said it. He was still looking at her. "She manages my accounts, and she has standing in anything related to the ranch's financial and legal situation." Whitfield adjusted. "Very well." She came into the room and stood beside Benjamin and looked at the document in his hands. The competing claim on Carter Ranch had been filed 6 days ago by a man named Gerald Marsh. She didn't know the name. The claim alleged that Benjamin's original title to the land acquired 15 years ago had been improperly registered, and that Marsh held a prior claim dating to 1858 that superseded it. 15 years ago. Carter Ranch had been in Benjamin's name for 15 years. "This is the first notice," she said. "Yes," Whitfield said. "The claim was filed at the territorial office in Santa Fe, and we are required to notify the current title holder within 10 days of filing." "Who is Gerald Marsh?" she said. "A land investor," Whitfield said. "He holds interests in several properties throughout the territory." "And has he filed similar competing claims on other properties?" she said. Whitfield hesitated. "Has he?" she said. "There are 2 other cases currently before the Territorial Board," Whitfield said, "both involving ranches in this area." She looked at Benjamin. I was looking at Whitfield with the expression she now understood as the one he wore when he was managing significant anger through significant control. "Who are the other 2?" Benjamin said. Whitfield named them. She didn't recognize the ranches, but she saw something move through Benjamin's face. He knew them. He knew the people attached to those names. "You have 60 days to file a formal response," Whitfield said. "The board will convene to hear the matter after that period." "I understand," Benjamin said. After Whitfield left, Benjamin stood holding the document, and neither of them spoke for a moment. "You know the other ranchers," she said. "Tom Aldred and Pete Garrison," he said. "Both within 20 miles. Both been on their land longer than I've been on mine." "And Gerald Marsh," she said. "Do you know that name?" "No," he said. He looked at her. "But someone does. Someone who knows the history of the titles in this area, and who knew which properties to target and when." She thought about Cole Reardon let go from the ranch 7 days ago. She thought about Marcus Harlow, the supply vendor she'd exposed. She thought about the specific timing. "You're thinking the same thing I'm thinking," he said. He was watching her face. "I'm thinking about sequence," she said, "and about whether it means what it appears to mean." "It means something," he said. "I don't know what yet." She looked at the document in his hands. "You need the attorney in Denver," she said. "Harding. He handles land cases." He looked at her. "The same attorney you pointed me toward," she said. "Yes," he said. A pause. "I'll write to him tonight." "I'll write to him," she said. "I already have the relationship, and I can frame both cases together in a way that might be useful." He handed her the document. The gesture was so simple and so complete. He handed her the document. He put it in her hands without hesitation, without qualification, without any of the provisos that men usually attach to the moment they handed authority to a woman. She took it. "All right," he said. She sat down at the desk and she pulled out paper and she began to write. He stood near the doorway for a moment watching her work. She could feel him there, the way she'd learned to feel the specific quality of his presence in a room. "Anna," he said. She kept writing. "Yes." "Last night," he said. "What I said." "You don't need to." "I want to," he said. "I want to be clear." She set the pen down and looked at him. "I have not said a true thing to another person about how I felt in 6 years," he said. Not since Margaret died. I don't say this because I want your sympathy. I say it because I need you to understand that what I said last night was not something I said carelessly." She looked at him. "I know," she said. "The situation with the ranch has nothing to do with what we said last night," she said. "And we're not going to let it change what needs to be done about the ranch or about anything else." He looked at her for a long moment. "No," he said. "We're not." She picked up the pen. "Then let me write this letter," she said. "And you go tell Clem about Marsh, because if there are 3 ranches targeted in this area, the other men need to know today." He straightened. He picked up his hat. He stopped at the door. He said with his back half turned in the voice that was quieter and less managed than his usual one, "I'm glad you were here today, when Whitfield came." She kept her eyes on the paper in front of her. "So am I," she said. He walked out. She heard his boots across the porch and down the steps and across the yard. She sat at his desk, and she wrote the letter, and while she wrote it, she was aware that the ranch outside the window was alive with the ordinary sounds of its own working, and she was inside it writing, and she had no clear name for what that meant, yet only that it meant something, and the meaning of it was growing in a direction she was no longer trying to redirect. She finished the letter. She folded it and sealed it. She put it with the outgoing mail. Then she sat for a moment in the chair at his desk, and she looked at the room, the desk and the shelf, with Margaret's photograph, and the fireplace, and the ledgers she'd rebuilt from the beginning, and she understood that she had stopped being a stranger in this house, somewhere in the past 8 weeks, without noticing the exact moment it happened. She got up and went back to the kitchen. Outside, Benjamin's voice carried across the yard as he found Clem and began to talk quick and direct, the voice of a man who moved fast when things required it. She listened to it for a moment. Then she started on dinner. George Harding arrived in Silver Creek on a Tuesday 12 days after she'd sent the second letter. She hadn't expected him to come in person. She'd expected a response by mail, another carefully written document with preliminary assessments and requests for additional information. What she got instead was a man in his early 50s stepping down from the stage with a leather case under his arm and asking the driver for directions to Carter Ranch before his boots had fully settled on the ground. Benjamin had gone into town for supplies that morning. He came back with George Harding sitting in the wagon beside him, which was how she learned what kind of man Harding was before she'd said a word to him. Benjamin Carter did not invite people onto his wagon unless he'd already decided something about them. She met them in the yard. Harding shook her hand with a grip that was neither performative nor weak. "Miss Whitaker," he said, "your letter was one of the clearest pieces of legal correspondence I've received from a non-attorney in 20 years of practice. I came because the situation you described warrants a face-to-face conversation, and because the Marsh matter is something I need to understand firsthand before I can advise Mr. Carter properly." "Come inside," she said. She had coffee ready within 5 minutes, which was not an accident. She'd developed a practical instinct for the shape of important conversations and the things that helped them go well. Harding sat at the main room table. Benjamin sat across from him. Anna sat at the end, which was her position in the household for functional reasons, and nobody questioned it. Harding opened his case. "I'll start with Miss Whitaker's situation," he said, "because it bears directly on the Marsh matter in ways that I believe are not coincidental." He set 3 documents on the table. "The loan your father took Miss Whitaker, the second one, was written by a man named Douglas Fenn out of Dodge City. Fenn is not primarily a lender. He is primarily a land accumulator. He operates by identifying properties with existing debt, extending secondary loans at rates that technically comply with the letter of the statute, while violating its intent, and then accelerating the debt at a predetermined point to force a sale under duress." The room was very quiet. "He's done this before," she said. 7 times in the past decade that I can document," Harding said. 3 of those cases involved the same attorney who told you nothing could be done." He looked at her steadily. "His name is Carswell. He is paid a referral fee for every case he closes without a fight." She absorbed this. She'd suspected something like it since Benjamin had first raised the question. Suspected it and put it away, because suspicion without evidence was a weight she couldn't afford to carry. Now it was evidence on a table in front of her, and it felt entirely different. It felt like something she could act on. "What about my father's land?" she said. "Can it be recovered?" "Yes," Harding said, without qualification, without the soft preparation of bad news. Simply yes. Fenn sold it 6 weeks ago to a buyer who I believe was aware of the circumstances. That sale can be challenged. The illegal interest calculation alone is sufficient to void the original debt structure. When the debt structure is voided, the foreclosure that followed it is voided. The sale that followed the foreclosure is then a separate matter, but one we can address. She put both hands flat on the table. She didn't look at Benjamin. She couldn't nod in that moment because the feeling that moved through her was too large to contain, and she wasn't going to let it out in front of a man she'd just met. "How long?" she said. Her voice was level. She was proud of that. 6 to 8 months before the territorial court, Harding said. Possibly faster if Fenn decides the legal exposure isn't worth the fight. He has other operations he'd prefer to protect. He might settle, she said. He might settle. Harding confirmed. Now. He shifted his papers. Gerald Marsh. Benjamin leaned forward slightly. "Marsh is not a coincidence," Harding said. He looked at Benjamin. "He is a business associate of Douglas Fenn. They have been co-investors on 4 properties in the past 8 years. The method is slightly different for established ranches with clear titles. Rather than debt accumulation, they use title disputes. They file competing claims on properties that have been in operation long enough to have procedural irregularities in their original registration. Small errors, timing discrepancies. Nothing that a reasonable court would consider material, but enough to create a cloud on the title that makes the property difficult to sell, refinance, or pass on to heirs. "They're not trying to win the case," Benjamin said. His voice was flat and precise. "No," Harding said. "They're trying to make the case expensive enough and prolonged enough that the property owner settles. Accepts a buyout at a fraction of value just to make the legal problem go away." Benjamin was quiet. She watched his face. She watched him make the same calculation she'd made 6 weeks earlier, sitting in a supply room with a letter in her hands. The calculation of a person who had just discovered that a situation they believed was permanent and immovable was neither of those things. It was just a situation someone had constructed, and constructed things could be taken apart. "The other 2 ranches," Benjamin said. "Aldred and Garrison. Same pattern." "Same pattern," Harding said. "Marsh filed all 3 claims within 4 days of each other. The timing is deliberate. He's hoping the legal cost of 3 simultaneous defenses breaks at least one of the 3 men. In my experience, a single landowner defending alone against a coordinated filing like this faces very poor odds. 3 landowners defending together face considerably better ones." Benjamin looked at Anna. She was already thinking through the implications. "You think they should coordinate their legal response," she said to Harding. "I think they should share legal representation, share the cost, and present a unified case to the board that demonstrates the pattern," Harding said. "A single competing claim can look like a legitimate dispute. 3 coordinated claims filed simultaneously by a known associate of a documented land fraud operator looks like what it is." "Will the board see it that way?" Benjamin said. "The board will see what we put in front of them," Harding said. "My job is to make sure what we put in front of them is impossible to misread." Benjamin sat back. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, which she recognized as what he did when he was making a decision that had already been made, and he was simply letting it settle. "What do you need from me to start?" he said. "The original title documentation," Harding said. "Everything from the initial land acquisition, deed of sale, registration records, any correspondence related to the transaction." "Anna," Benjamin said. "I know where it is," she said. She was already standing. She went to the desk, to the locked drawer where she'd reorganized the ranch's legal documents in the 3rd week, and she retrieved the original title file. She'd read it once when she organized it because she read everything, and now she was grateful for that habit because she knew exactly what it contained. She put it on the table in front of Harding. He opened it. He read. The room was quiet, except for the sound of papers turning. Outside, she could hear the ranch continuing its ordinary life, the sounds of the hands working horses in the yard. Clem's voice somewhere giving a direction. "This is in good order," Harding said. The original registration has a date discrepancy of 11 days that Marsh's filing is probably targeting. It's not material. No court that's operating in good faith would find it material. But it gives Marsh the technical opening he needs to file. Can we close it? She said. Harding looked at her. Yes, there's a correction process. It requires a filing with the territorial office and a supporting affidavit from the original transaction parties. Do you know if any of the original parties are still accessible? The man who sold me the land is in Albuquerque, Benjamin said. He was alive as of 2 years ago. We corresponded about a water rights matter. Get me a letter of introduction, Harding said. I'll go to Albuquerque. I'll have it written tonight, Anna said. Harding looked at her again. This time the look was not assessment. It was the look of a man who had identified something useful and was taking note of it for future reference. Miss Whitaker, he said, have you considered reading law? Benjamin made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in that direction. She said, I'm currently employed. So I see, Harding said. The meeting lasted 3 hours. By the end of it, she had filled 2 pages of notes. Harding had his introduction letters and his documentation, and the outline of a coordinated legal strategy involving all 3 ranches had been agreed upon in principle. Harding would contact Aldred and Garrison the following day. When Harding left, she drove him back to town in the wagon because Benjamin needed to meet with Clem about the morning's work that had been delayed. She sat beside Harding on the wagon seat, and the road to town was 4 miles, and she used them. The Fenn operation, she said. When you take him to court for my father's land, how strong is the case? Very strong, he said. I've been waiting for a clean case against Fenn for 3 years. The interest rate irregularity in your father's loan is the cleanest violation I've found. And Carswell, she said. The attorney. Carswell is going to have a difficult year, Harding said. His voice was even. His arrangement with Fenn constitutes professional misconduct. I've already filed a complaint with the territorial bar. She looked at the road ahead. He told me there was nothing I could do, she said. I was 24 years old, and I'd lost everything, and I sat in his office, and he told me the situation was what it was, and nothing could be done. I know, Harding said, and I'm sorry for it. She said nothing for a moment. Then, what he did gave me 7 months of believing it. 7 months of carrying something as finished when it wasn't. Yes, Harding said. That's the real cost of what he did, not the land, the 7 months. She thought about that. She thought about where she'd been 7 months ago and where she was now. She thought about a rainy porch and a worn suitcase and the decision to knock 3 times on a door and mean it. She thought about what those 7 months had brought her. She didn't say any of this to Harding, but she turned it over quietly in the space behind the conversation, the way you turned over a stone to see what was underneath it, and what she found was not what she expected. She was not sorry for the 7 months. That realization settled into her with the quiet weight of something true. She dropped Harding at the stage office and drove back to the ranch. The 2 days following Harding's visit were dense with practical work. She wrote correspondence, organized the documentation. Harding needed and drafted the initial outline of the coordinated defense strategy in terms clear enough that Tom Aldred and Pete Garrison, neither of whom she'd met, could understand it without legal training. Benjamin reviewed everything she wrote before it went out, and he made 1 or 2 adjustments, and the rest he signed without changing a word. She noticed this. She didn't comment on it. Tom Aldred came to Carter Ranch on Thursday. He was a broad-weathered man in his 60s who shook her hand like a man who'd decided to take her seriously before he arrived, which meant Benjamin had said something to him in advance. Pete Garrison sent his son, a young man named Will, because Pete was ill and couldn't travel. Will Garrison was in his mid-20s and sharp-eyed, and very clearly trying to assess the situation as quickly as possible. She sat at the table with both of them and Benjamin, and she explained the legal strategy in plain language. She explained what Marsh was doing, why, and how a coordinated response changed the odds. She explained Harding's role in the cost-sharing arrangement she and Benjamin had already discussed. She answered their questions directly and without hedging. At the end of it, Aldred looked at Benjamin. She wrote this, he said, meaning the strategic outline on the table. She did, Benjamin said. Aldred looked at her. How'd you come to understand land law this well? Necessity, she said. Mostly recent necessity. Aldred made a sound that was the frontier equivalent of impressed. He signed the agreement to retain Harding jointly. Will Garrison signed for his father. After they left, Benjamin stood near the fireplace and looked at her. You convinced them in an hour, he said. The situation convinced them, she said. I just presented it clearly. Anna, he said. And she'd noticed that when he used her name now, which was more often than before the storm, it was rarely followed immediately by what he'd meant to say. It sat there for a moment first like he was listening to the sound of it. What? She said. I owe you a conversation, he said. That isn't about the ranch. She set down the papers she'd been reorganizing. All right, she said. He came away from the fireplace. He didn't sit down. He stood in the middle of the room the way he stood when he was committing to something, both feet placed and his hands still. Since Margaret died, he said, I have not wanted anyone in this house, not permanently. I told myself it was because the ranch was enough and I was enough for the ranch and the arrangement worked and there was no reason to change it. She waited. I was wrong about all of that, he said. This house was not working. I was not enough for it. The arrangement was deteriorating in ways I'd stopped seeing because I'd stopped looking. He paused. You looked. You came in here and you looked at everything straight, and you fixed what was broken, and you found what was being stolen, and you held my fence in a storm, and you wrote legal correspondence that convinced a man who does this for a living to come in person. He stopped. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, I stopped thinking of you as someone who worked here. She kept her face level. Her heart was doing something she had no practical use for, and she managed it. What do you think of me as? She said. He looked at her with the directness that was the most consistent thing about him. Someone I don't want to be without, he said. The room was very quiet. That's a significant statement, she said. I know what it is, he said. I've been thinking about it for 3 weeks, and I'm not saying it carelessly. I know you're not, she said. You don't say anything carelessly. He looked at her. Is it something you can consider? She looked back at him. She thought about what she'd realized on the road back from town with Harding. That she was not sorry for the 7 months. That the 7 months had brought her here, and here was not a place she'd planned to arrive at, and it was without question the truest place she'd been in years. I've been considering it for 3 weeks, she said. I've been trying not to. Something moved across his face. Relief maybe, though on him, it was quieter than that word suggested. Why trying not to, he said. Because I work for you, she said. And because I was raised to be careful with the difference between gratitude and something real. This isn't gratitude, he said. No, she agreed. It isn't. He took one step toward her. Then he stopped, because he was a man who had learned to stop at one step rather than overrun a situation, which was both the thing she found most steadying about him and the thing that sometimes made her want to close the distance herself. She didn't close it. Not yet. I need to know that you're certain, she said. Not because I doubt you, but because I'm not someone who does anything halfway, and if this is real, then it's going to be entirely real, and I want to know that you understand that. I understand it, he said. It's part of why I'm certain. She held his gaze for a long moment. Then something in her, that had been very carefully held together for a very long time, not just the weeks on this ranch, but the years before it, the farm and the loss and the 7 months of walking forward into a closed door, released its holding. Quietly, without drama. The way things let go when the reason for holding them has passed. Then yes, she said. It's something I can more than consider. He crossed the room. He stopped very close to her, close enough that she had to look up slightly to meet his eyes, which she was not accustomed to. He raised one hand and touched her face. Just her jaw. Just for a moment. The touch of a man who was being very deliberate about what he was doing. All right, he said, very quietly. All right, she said. They stood there for a moment, neither of them moving, while the ranch outside made its ordinary sounds, and the afternoon light came through the windows, and the two of them stood in it. Then he let his hand drop and stepped back one step, and she thought briefly that she had never encountered a man whose restraint made her feel more rather than less, and she filed that away as another thing she understood about him that she was still learning the full measure of. "I have to meet Clem at 4, he said. "I know," she said. "Go." He picked up his hat from the desk. He stopped at the door. "Dinner tonight," he said. "I'd like to eat at the table, not at the desk." "The table," she said. "Yes." He left. She stood in the middle of the room for a moment, then she sat down in the chair by the desk, and she put her hands in her lap, and she looked at the wall, and she allowed herself for exactly 1 minute to feel the full weight of the afternoon. Then she stood up and went back to work. The letter from Harding arrived 10 days later with news she hadn't let herself fully anticipate. The man who had sold Benjamin the land was not only alive in Albuquerque. He told Harding, waiting for someone to ask him to correct the title registration error for years. He had known about it within months of the original transaction, and had attempted to file the correction twice, but had been told by a clerk at the territorial office, who no longer worked there, that no correction was necessary. Harding's letter was restrained in its legal language and incandescent in its implications. The clerk who had dismissed the correction attempts had been for a period that overlapped with Marsh's filing practice, employed on a part-time consulting basis by a firm with documented ties to Douglas Fenn. The same network, the same hands. Reaching back 15 years into the paperwork of a land transaction that a man named Benjamin Carter had made in good faith, leaving a small procedural error in place that could be triggered whenever the network decided a ranch was worth targeting. She read the letter at the desk, and then she went to find Benjamin. Howe was in the barn with Clem, going over the condition of the horses after the long work of the previous month. She came to the barn door and said, "I need 2 minutes." Clem looked at her. He looked at her face. He said, "I'll check the south stalls," and walked away. She had not asked him to. He did it because after 3 months on this ranch, Clem Dawson had updated his assessment of Anna Whitaker completely and permanently. She gave Benjamin the letter. He read it. She watched his face. She watched him put it together. "Fenn's network placed the error," he said. "It was not a question." "Or maintained it," she said. "The error may have been genuine. What wasn't genuine was the assurance that it didn't need to be corrected." "They've been holding it for 15 years, he said. "Waiting." "Waiting for a property worth targeting," she said. "Carter Ranch has grown considerably in 15 years. He held the letter in both hands and looked at it. "How does this change the case?" he said. "It changes it substantially," she said. A title error Marsh was exploiting becomes a manufactured vulnerability that Marsh and Fenn created and maintained deliberately. That's not a civil land dispute. That's fraud. Harding can go to a criminal court, not just the Territorial Land Board. The shift in Benjamin's expression was the one she had learned to read as the specific combination of anger and decisiveness. That was how he looked when a situation clarified into something he knew exactly how to respond to. "When does Harding go before the land board?" he said. "He's filing a motion to have the civil case suspended pending criminal investigation," she said. "He thinks the board will grant it. If they do, Marsh's claim is effectively frozen." "Frozen," he said. "Indefinitely," she said. "And Fenn's exposure in both the criminal and civil courts will make him very motivated to settle everything. Your title, my father's land, Aldred and Garrison, all of it." Benjamin was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the letter. Then he looked at her. "You put all of this together," he said. "From a supply ledger discrepancy and an overcharging vendor." "I put together what was in front of me," she said. "The connections were already there. Other people looked at the same things for years and didn't find them," he said. "Other people weren't starting from the beginning," she said. "And other people weren't looking for patterns. I was looking for patterns because I'd lost something to a pattern and I knew what one felt like." He said, "Come here." She crossed the barn to where he was standing, and when she reached him, he took the letter from her hands and put it in his coat pocket. And then he put both hands on her shoulders and looked at her directly. "I have something to ask you," he said. "And I want to ask it now today, not after the courts have settled, and not when everything is resolved and tidy. I want to ask it in the middle of it. Because I need you to know that this is not about what you've done for the ranch, or what you've found in the accounts, or what any court is going to decide." She looked at him. Her heart was entirely still. "I'm asking you to marry me," he said. "Not as the woman who saved my ranch, because you didn't save it, the courts are going to do that, and you'll have done the work that made it possible, but I'm capable of gratitude without marrying someone. I'm asking because I have not wanted a future since Margaret died, and I want one now, and it looks like you in it, and I don't see the point in waiting until everything is settled to say so." She stood inside what he'd said for a moment. She felt the weight of it, the realness of it. The way it had none of the performance that proposals sometimes had none of the staging. Just a man in a barn with horse smells and afternoon light, his hands on her shoulders, saying something true. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. Something in his face opened that she'd never seen open before. Not the almost smile, not the controlled warmth, something fuller and less managed and entirely real. "Yes," he said. "You asked me clearly," she said. "I answered clearly." He pulled her toward him, and she went, and he held her with the same certainty he brought to everything else, complete and grounded and without apology. They stood like that in the barn, while Clem made careful noises in the south stalls that indicated he was going to stay there for as long as was needed. She pressed her face against his shoulder, and she felt beneath the wool of his coat the solid, particular warmth of a man who had decided to come back to the world of the living, and had made that decision at considerable personal cost and meant it entirely. She meant it entirely too. After a moment she said into his shoulder, "Clem knows." She felt him make the sound that was his version of a laugh. The real one. Not the reflex, the actual thing. "Clem has known for 6 weeks, he said. She lifted her head. 6 weeks. "He told me 3 weeks ago that if I was going to do something about it, I should do it before I made a fool of myself in front of the hands," he said. His exact words. She thought about Clem Dawson, who said almost nothing, who brought her honey from his wife's bees, who made himself scarce in the south stalls right now. "I like him considerably more than I initially expected to," she said. "Benjamin said, he feels the same way about you." She stepped back. She looked at him. She looked at the man who had opened a door on a rainy evening to a woman with a suitcase and a question, and had said not warmly, not generously, simply, practically, "Come in." She had come in. And the house that had gathered dust around his grief was going to be a home again, not because she had fixed it, but because two people who understood the cost of loss had decided separately, and then together, that the cost of staying closed was higher. "The hands are going to have opinions," she said. "They already do," he said. "Danny has been insufferable about it for a month." She smiled. The full thing, not the careful version. He looked at her smile the way a man looked at something he'd been waiting to see. "Come on," she said. "Harding needs a response letter by tomorrow morning." "Of course he does," Benjamin said. She walked out of the barn. He followed her. Behind them in the south stalls, they heard Clem Dawson say to the horse he'd been pretending to check on, in a voice that was carrying more than he probably intended, "Finally." Clem's single word hung in the air of the barn long after Anna and Benjamin had walked out of it, and she carried it with her all the way back to the house. Finally. She understood the weight of that word better than anyone. Finally was not a small word. Finally was the word that came after a long time of something being almost right and not quite, of two people circling the truth of a thing, because the truth required a kind of courage that the practical business of daily life made it easy to postpone. Finally was the word for the end of postponing. She sat at the desk that evening and wrote Harding's response letter, and she was aware with a clarity that she hadn't allowed herself before that she was sitting at a desk in a house that was going to be her home. Not a temporary employment. Not a position that would last until something better presented itself. Home. The word had a different weight than it had carried for years, and she let herself feel it fully, the way she'd been disciplined about not feeling things until they were real and confirmed. This was real. This was confirmed. She finished the letter and sealed it and set it with the outgoing mail. Benjamin came in from the final evening check of the ranch at 9, which was his ordinary time. He came into the main room, and he looked at her at the desk, and he said, "Done." "Done," she said. He sat in the chair by the fireplace, the one across from where she usually sat, and she moved from the desk to her chair, and they sat by the fire, the way they had done many evenings, except that tonight the quality of the silence between them was entirely different. It was not the careful silence of two people managing distance. It was the silence of two people who had stopped managing anything and were simply in the same room, present and comfortable in the specific way that required a long time to build and could not be manufactured. "I want to tell you something," she said. He looked at her. "When I walked here in the rain 10 weeks ago," she said, "I told myself I was coming for a job. And I was. That was true. But I think I was also coming because I'd been walking for 7 months and I needed somewhere that felt like it was worth stopping for." He was quiet. "I knew from the gate," she said. "The fencing, the way this place was kept. I knew there was something here worth stopping for." She paused. "I didn't know what it was yet." "And now," he said. She looked at him across the firelight. "Now I know exactly what it was," she said. He reached across the space between them and took her hand. He held it the same way he held everything, with complete certainty and no performance. She looked at their hands, and she thought about her father saying the situation is always moving, whether you move it or not, so you might as well decide the direction. She'd decided the direction. She was here. The Territorial Land Board convened on the Marsh matter 6 weeks after Harding filed his motion. Then, the criminal investigation into the Fenn network had been formally opened by the Territorial Court in Santa Fe, a development that Harding described in his letter as unprecedented in scope and long overdue in timing. 3 investigators had been sent from Santa Fe to examine the records of the Fenn operation, and the clerk who had twice turned away the correction of Benjamin's title registration had been identified located in a town 40 miles south, and was now cooperating with the investigation in exchange for considerations she suspected Harding had negotiated with a precision that bordered on ruthlessness. She admired that in a legal professional. The Land Board hearing itself was not dramatic in the way that she'd half expected it to be. It was paperwork and testimony, and the specific language of legal procedure, and it lasted 2 days in a hearing room in the county seat 40 miles from Silver Creek. She went with Benjamin. Tom Aldred came with his eldest son. Will Garrison came for his father again, who was recovering but not yet strong enough for the journey. Harding was extraordinary. She watched him work, and she understood why he'd built the reputation he had. He was not theatrical. He was not the kind of attorney who performed for a room. He was the kind who constructed an argument the way a good craftsman built a fence post, wire by wire. Each element set in correctly, before the next was added, until by the end, what you had was something that could not be moved by ordinary force. By the end of the first day, Marsh's attorney looked like a man who had arrived at a gunfight and discovered the other side had brought an army. By the end of the second day, the board chair asked Marsh's attorney directly whether his client wished to continue the proceeding or explore a settlement arrangement. There was a recess. It lasted 4 hours. She sat in the hallway outside the hearing room with Benjamin, and she felt him beside her, steady and present. And she thought about how different it was to wait with someone versus waiting alone. She'd done a great deal of waiting alone in the past 7 months. She'd become very good at it. But this was better. This was not better because it was easier. It was better because someone knew what the waiting meant and was in it with her without requiring her to explain or manage how she was feeling. She leaned her shoulder against his. He pressed back. That was all. It was enough. When Marsh's attorney came back out, he proposed a settlement figure and a timeline. Harding rejected it in 45 seconds and counter-proposed terms that were, she could see from the attorney's expression, considerably more than Marsh had authorized him to accept. Another recess. Shorter this time. The final terms were Marsh's competing claim on all 3 properties withdrawn with prejudice, meaning it could not be refiled. A payment to cover the legal costs of all 3 defending ranchers. A formal acknowledgement submitted to the Territorial Land Board that the claim had been without merit. That last part was Harding's addition. She'd suggested it in the letter she'd written him 3 weeks ago. Not just withdrawal, but acknowledgement. Because the difference between quietly going away and formally admitting the claim had no merit was the difference between a door that could be reopened and a door that was permanently closed. Harding had included it without comment, which was how she knew he'd thought of it too. Benjamin signed the settlement agreement. Aldred signed it. Will Garrison signed it for his father. When they walked out of the hearing room, Aldred shook her hand before he shook Benjamin's. "Your wife," he said to Benjamin, though the wedding was still 6 weeks away, "is someone I'd want on my side in any fight." "She generally is," Benjamin said. He looked at her. The thing in his face that had opened in the barn was still open. She was beginning to understand that it was going to stay that way. The Douglas Fenn matter resolved faster than Harding had predicted, which she suspected meant that Fenn had resources for legal defense, but had not anticipated a coordinated case of this quality and had underestimated how thoroughly Harding had documented the pattern. Fenn settled the criminal matter with the territorial court before it went to trial. The civil case against the fraudulent land seizures, including her father's land, settled 3 weeks after the criminal resolution. The letter came on a Wednesday. She was in the kitchen when Danny brought the mail in. He handed her the envelope from Harding's office with the specific expression of someone who knew it was important and was very pleased to be the person delivering it. She thanked him and waited until he left the kitchen, and then she opened it. Harding's letter was 2 pages. She read the first page standing at the counter. She read the second page sitting down. The fraudulent debt had been voided in full. The foreclosure that followed it had been voided. The sale of her father's land to Fenn's buyer had been unwound. The land was as of the date of the letter clear in her name. Harding had arranged the re-registration. He enclosed the document. She set the letter down. She sat at the kitchen table with the document in her hands, the paper that said the land her father had worked and her mother had planted a kitchen garden in, and where she had learned to read and to calculate, and to understand what it meant to be responsible for something real. That land was hers. She cried. She hadn't cried over it in 7 months. She'd told herself she was facing forward, and she had genuinely been, but she was also a person who had carried a loss that wasn't finished and hadn't known it. And now it was finished, and the carrying was done, and the release of it came out of her without any control at all. She let it. She gave herself 5 minutes. Then she wiped her face, stood up, and went to find Benjamin, who was at the desk. He looked up when she came in. He looked at her face at the evidence of the 5 minutes she'd allowed herself, and he stood up without saying anything. She held out the document. He took it. He read it. He looked up. "It's done," she said. He set the document on the desk, and he came to her, and he put his arms around her, and she let him hold her, the way she hadn't let anyone hold her in a very long time fully, without keeping any part of herself at a managed distance. She pressed her face against his chest, and she felt him breathe. "It's done," he said. "Yes," she said. They stood like that for a while. Then she said into his coat, "I need to think about what to do with the land." She felt him make the sound, the real laugh. "Right now? Not right now," she said. "But soon." He held her a little tighter. "We'll figure it out," he said. "Not I'll help you figure it out. We'll figure it out." The pronoun of a person who had fully committed to a shared future. She noticed it. She filed it in the place where she kept the things about him that she was still learning the full measure of. They were married on the 2nd Saturday of October. She had not planned an elaborate wedding, and she did not want one. She wanted the justice of the peace in Silver Creek and the people she had come to know over the past 4 months, and a dress that was good quality and fit her properly and did not get in the way. Clem stood beside Benjamin. Danny stood beside Clem and spent the entire ceremony trying to manage an expression that was approximately 15 years older than he was, with limited success. Harding came up from Denver for it, which she hadn't expected, and which moved her more than she let show. Tom Aldred brought his wife, a small, fierce woman named Ruth, who shook Anna's hand at the reception and said, "My husband told me what you did. I want you to know that if you ever need anything, you come to us. That's not politeness. That's a fact." She believed her. The hands were at the reception, all of them, the yard of Carter Ranch filled with people in their good clothes, eating the food she'd organized, and the food Ruth Aldred and 2 other ranchers' wives had contributed, and the sound of people in good spirits in a place that had not heard that sound in a long time. She stood at the edge of it for a moment in the early evening, and she looked at the yard and the people in it, and she let herself feel the full fact of where she was and how she'd arrived here. 10 weeks ago. A worn suitcase, a rain-soaked coat, 4 miles on foot because she'd decided the direction. Benjamin came to stand beside her. "What are you thinking?" he said. "I'm thinking about your gait," she said. He looked at her. "My gait. When I walked up the road the first time," she said. "Your gait was in excellent condition, better than everything around it. I noticed it. And I thought, this is a man who pays attention to what matters functionally." She looked at him. I was right about that. He looked at her in the way he had that was still not fully comfortable, not because it was unwelcome, but because it was so unguarded. He'd had to learn how to look at her like that. She'd watched him learn it over weeks, and she understood what it cost him, and she valued it accordingly. "You assessed me from the gate," he said. "I assessed what was visible from the gate," she said. "I did considerably better once I was inside." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "My gait isn't the only thing I keep in good condition." "No," she said. "It isn't." He took her hand. They stood together at the edge of the yard while Silver Creek celebrated the end of one kind of life and the beginning of another, and the sky over the territory went from orange to deep blue, and the lamps came up in the yard, and the sound of people happy in a good place filled the evening air. The letter she'd sent to Harding that first time, the one she'd written alone at the kitchen table while Benjamin slept down the hall, the one she'd given to Danny to take to town without telling anyone, that letter had set everything in motion. She thought about it sometimes. The specific act of sitting down and writing clearly and honestly about what had happened to her, not asking for sympathy, just stating the facts and asking whether something could be done. Something could be done. Something always could be done if you were willing to look at the situation straight and ask the right questions of the right people. Her father had told her that. Benjamin had shown her in his specific and practical way that it was true. Harding had proven it with documentation. She was going to do something with her father's land. She and Benjamin had talked about it several times in the weeks between the settlement and the wedding. Practical conversations at the kitchen table and the dinner table, and once at 11 at night when neither of them could sleep, and they'd ended up talking through the darkness about what land meant and what it was worth and what the right use of it was. She was going to keep it. She was going to hire a man and his family to work it on a fair wage arrangement she'd designed herself, one that gave the family a path to ownership over 15 years if they chose to take it. It was the arrangement her father should have had when things got difficult. It was the arrangement that would have kept the farm in the family if someone had offered it. She couldn't go back. She could make it mean something going forward. Benjamin had read her proposal for the arrangement and handed it back to her with one suggested revision, a small adjustment to the timeline that made it slightly more generous to the tenant family, and she had looked at the revision and understood exactly why he'd made it and loved him for it with a fullness that she still sometimes found startling. The word came to her without effort, the way true words did. Loved. Not the word she'd been managing against for 10 weeks. Not the possibility she'd been filing carefully in a category marked "not yet examined." The finished, simple, unambiguous fact of it. She loved Benjamin Carter. She had probably loved him since somewhere around the 3rd week when he had sat across from her at the kitchen table at 1 in the morning and turned a whiskey glass in his hands and told her about his wife's father trying to buy the ranch and the specific quality of his voice when he said he wasn't going to let anyone take what he'd built. She hadn't known it then as love. She'd known it as recognition. The feeling of seeing someone clearly and finding that what you saw was someone you wanted to keep seeing. Recognition was where love started, she thought. Everything else was just the accumulation of days. The evening wore on. Clem's wife, a woman named May, who was warm and direct and had clearly been waiting a long time for this evening to happen, danced with Clem in the yard, which was not a sight anyone had apparently witnessed before, given the response from the hands. Danny asked Ruth Aldred's youngest daughter to dance, and was refused politely, and then accepted gracefully, and in a way that suggested he'd learned that particular lesson from watching someone do it correctly. She danced with Benjamin. He was not a man who danced easily. He danced with the same controlled precision he brought to physical things that required it competent and deliberate, and not particularly concerned with whether it looked effortless. She matched him. They moved through the music, and she thought about the morning she'd arrived, the cold calculation she'd done, walking up the road, the professional assessment of a man she'd never met, based on the condition of his property. She'd been right about the functional facts of him. She hadn't imagined the parts she'd found later. The kitchen table at 1 in the morning, the whiskey glass he poured and held and rarely drank, the way he'd said her name for the first time in a voice that was doing something he wasn't entirely choosing. "You're thinking again," he said. "I'm always thinking," she said. "What about this time?" She looked at him. "About the gate," she said. "And everything after it." He turned them through the music. Around them the yard was full and warm and alive with the specific sound of a celebration that was also a beginning. "Any regrets?" he said. The question was quiet, genuine. He was a man who asked real questions and wanted real answers. She thought about it honestly because she owed him that. She thought about the 7 months and the hard miles and the closed doors and the one door that had opened because she'd knocked on it with enough conviction that it couldn't stay closed. She thought about her father's land recovered, ready to become something new in someone else's hands, with a path forward that her father would have recognized as fair. She thought about the supply ledger that had started everything, and the attorney who had tried to close it down, and the other attorney who had opened it back up, and the web of connected corruptions that was now unraveling in a courtroom in Santa Fe, while she stood in her own yard in the October evening. She thought about the man she was dancing with. The way he'd said, "I have not wanted a future since Margaret died, and I want one now." The completeness of it. The courage it took for a man like him to say a thing like that out loud. "No," she said. "Not one." He held her a little closer. "Good," he said. The night went on the way. Good nights did slowly, and then suddenly. And at the end of it, the guests went home, and the hands went to the bunkhouse, and Clem and May went to their wagon, and Danny went last of all, looking back over his shoulder at the house, with the expression of someone who had watched something he'd been hoping to watch for a long time, and was satisfied with how it had come out. The yard was quiet. She stood on the porch and looked at it. The lamplight, the emptied space that still held the warmth of all the people who had been in it. Benjamin came to stand beside her. 10 weeks ago, he said. 10 weeks ago, she agreed. You walked 4 miles in the rain to knock on my door, he said. I did. And told me I wasn't the man people said I was if I turned you away without 5 minutes, he said. I needed the job, she said. He looked at her. The smile that had taken weeks to arrive, and was now something she saw with regularity, and still found she was grateful for every time. You needed more than the job, he said. Yes, she said. I did. So did you. He put his arm around her, and she leaned against him, and they stood on the porch of Carter Ranch in the quiet October evening, while the territory settled around them into the particular stillness that came after a good thing had been finished and a better one was beginning. She thought about everything it had taken to arrive here. The loss and the road, and the 7 months of facing forward into closed doors. The decision to try one more door. The gate in excellent condition that told her someone worth knowing lived past it. She thought about what she would tell anyone who asked someday how a woman who came looking for work found a life she hadn't known to look for. She would tell them what her father had told her. The situation is always moving, whether you move it or not, so you might as well decide the direction. She had decided the direction. She had walked 4 miles in the rain and knocked on a door and refused to be turned away. And on the other side of it was a man who had forgotten how to want a future and a house that had gathered dust around his grief, and a life that needed exactly what she had to bring to it. She had brought all of it, every hard-earned skill, and every practical instinct, and every lesson her father had left her, and every mile of the road that had led here. And what she had built in return was not just a position or a security or a resolution to the things that had been taken from her. What she had built was a home, and standing in it, in the October dark, with his arm around her, and the land stretching out in every direction around them, and every closed door now permanently behind her. Anna Whitaker. Carter understood with the full precision of a woman who had always known how to look at things straight, that this was not the ending of the story she'd been living. This was what the whole story had been moving toward. This was where she was always going to arrive, because she had refused to stop walking until she found a place worth stopping for. And she had. And she would never leave.